The government in no way thinks it would be appropriate to have an election in the context of a pandemic. Canadians expect governments to work collaboratively with opposition parties in the House of Commons, with provinces and territories. That's something that we're committed to doing. I'm very confident in the throne speech of Vashi that the opposition parties will see many elements with which they agree. We hope they're not irresponsible enough to force an election. We would welcome their suggestions.
1 week from tomorrow, the Liberals will deliver their throne speech, and before they do, the Prime Minister, according to his office, will be canvassing opposition leaders for their thoughts on what the fall agenda should look like. That speech could trigger an election since it will go to a vote of confidence. Let's bring in the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, to hear about what he's looking for. Hi, Mr. Singh. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you, Ms. Cabellos.
I have a bunch of questions about the throne speech, but I did listen to your press conference earlier today, and you were very critical of the Liberals' approach, in particular to the tariff issue. That was before the U.S. decided to back down, at least right now, and back away from those tariffs. Does that show that the Liberals actually did have the right approach?
Well, I know that there's a couple of things that need to be put in place. We need a proactive solution as opposed to just responding with tariffs whenever a tariff is imposed. And secondly, and I think most importantly, there needs to be a plan of what we do with the revenue from those tariffs. It has to go towards manufacturing, protecting the workers in Canada, and I think that's what's missing in their approach.
Are you talking about counter tariffs? Like those revenues would have to be specifically targeted?
Well, the revenues that are derived from the counter tariffs should be clearly put towards helping those who've been impacted by the tariffs in the first place.
Right. I understand that. I guess I'm talking, those tariffs will now, no longer have to be applied because the original tariffs were withdrawn by the United States. You talk about,
absolutely.
Yeah, you're saying that the approach was too reactive, not proactive enough. But in fact, their approach seemed to have worked because the U.S. backed down.
Well, I think that it's not fair to workers to be in a situation where they don't know their future. And we've seen in the past that the counter tariffs were used, but that money wasn't clearly put towards supporting workers. So what I'm saying is that a proactive plan would be that with the previous revenue that was raised when we did put in place counter tariffs, not this time, but in the past, that money could have been set aside to support workers for a potential future problem or a future scenario where there's tariffs imposed. So that type of proactive thinking is something that I think that the government is missing, putting in place measures to proactively be ready for the potential eventuality of a tariff so you can actually help the workers out.
I take your point on that. I guess I wondered when you said proactive, do you think that there is something the government can do in advance to predict the way that this administration will work? Like, was there any way to know that the U.S. was going to levy these tariffs in the first place? Because certainly we've had no indication that that's the case.
No, I think it's fair to say that President Trump has been very erratic and often irrational with some of the decisions. To make a decision or to announce one and then to withdraw it is very erratic, but it doesn't excuse the Liberal government from coming up with a plan that is more proactive in terms of thinking ahead of how we can support local industries like the aluminum sector. In the potential case of a tariff scenario, there needs to be more thought to a plan that's not just responding with a counter tariff, but something that is thought out ahead of time.
Okay, let me switch to the throne speech and to the Prime Minister's office today saying that now, contrary to what we understood yesterday, the Prime Minister will in fact be reaching out to yourself and your counterparts in other opposition parties. Is a date for that meeting, has a date been set?
Yes, that's been scheduled for Friday. But I want to make it clear that with the Liberal government, we've seen throne speeches before, and we've seen the government say nice things and say the right words. They've talked about pharmacare in the past. But even before the pandemic erupted, they did nothing to advance pharmacare in a meaningful way. We even put forward a bill to say, here's a bill that would help outline the first steps. The Liberal government was unwilling to do anything. They've talked at length about doing things to better protect the environment, but fossil fuel subsidies continue. So I'm not going to be surprised if the Liberal government and Prime Minister Trudeau lay out some things that are good, if they talk about some of the things that we want to hear. But I'm more concerned about the implementation. I want to see help get to Canadians as opposed to the Liberal government saying the right things.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point on pharmacare. I know, for example, that I think in the last budget they had allotted $6 billion to it, somewhere around that, whereas we know that the overall price tag was going to be much larger than that. And they had indicated that that was for preliminary consultations with provinces. But implementing pharmacare, like I said, all studies have shown would cost a lot more. Does that mean that you will be looking, for example, for that line item in a budget to support it?
Well, that's one concrete test instead of just the empty words that might be in a throne speech, which are effectively meaningless if they don't follow through. We'll look at the budget as a test of seeing if those words are backed up. But there's another test, Ms. Capellos, that we can look at right now. And that's the fact that while on one hand, the Liberal government is talking about trying to help people with the throne speech, currently the proposal they have to change CERB towards EI is going to put 3 million Canadians in a worse off position. We're asking the Liberal government to stop that approach and instead keep the support at the $2,000, make it easy to access, instead of what they're proposing, which is to cut it up to $1,600, cut it down to $1,600, and to make it harder to access. That to me is the exact opposite of saying one thing of trying to help Canadians, but then the reality is what they're proposing is going to hurt Canadians. So I guess particularly given a second wave.
Yeah, no, I take that point. I guess I'm just trying to understand and make it clear for our viewers, what specifically then are you looking for? Like, you know, the greater context of this is that the government could very much need your support in order to withstand that initial confidence vote where the throne speech is concerned. If they even deliver a budget, obviously that would be subject to a confidence vote again because it has to do with money. But the first one, we don't even know for sure that budget is coming. So where the throne speech is concerned, do you need to see, for example, an explicit promise to change what you just talked about, to up the EI payments to $2,000 instead of what they've outlined already?
That would be one test. That would be, to me, a concrete demonstration that the Liberal government is not just going to give us empty words in a throne speech, but actually willing to do something concretely to stop hurting Canadians for no reason. To cut the support by 20% when Canadians were just getting by with the $2,000, to me, really shows what the Liberal government's really out to do. They're not really going to help people if they're on the same breath talking about helping people, but then proposing a plan that's going to make it harder for Canadians to get help, particularly when we know that there's a second wave arriving. So yes, that's going to be something that I'm going to look very closely at. If the Liberal government is truly committed to helping people, then they need to move away from this cutting of the help that Canadians need when we know that there's going to be lots of need given a second wave that's imminent.
You used the word, Mr. Singh, test. Does that mean that if you don't see something like that, you'd be unwilling to support the throne speech? Like, I'm just trying to gauge what are the hills that you are prepared to die on, or if there are any at all, because in previous interviews that we've had, you've been really, sort of stepping away from the idea that you would try to force an election over any one single issue.
Well, I want to, I guess on that issue, make it really clear that my goal isn't to find a reason to go to an election. I want to help Canadians. I want to make sure they get the support and help they need. So we'll look at the throne speech very carefully, evaluate it, and make our decision whether to support it or not. But I just want to point out the idea that whatever they say, it's not as important the empty words that the Liberal government says, but it's more important to see their actions. So one of those actions that would give me some confidence and give Canadians confidence that the Liberal government really wants to help would be to stop with this proposed change that would reduce the help for families that are in need. That to me would be a clear sign that the Liberal government's going to go beyond more than just words.
And I'm wondering the level also, before I let you go, Mr. Singh, of specificity that you'd like to see, because I'm thinking, for example, of when you stipulated in exchange for your support, you would like to see more sick days, right? You wanted to see that help for workers where sick days were concerned. You were able to get the government to move on it, but not to the degree that you had originally asked. So instead, what ended up happening was, a 6-month basically program for provinces that the federal government subsidizes. But certainly, if you are one of those workers for under that plan for the next 6 months, you have no guarantee of it after that. Are you, strategizing to try and keep your asks very broad so that you can claim wins after the fact? Or will you be open and transparent about how specific you'd like to see the government get on those items?
Well, really, my test is, or my goal, my focus is, can we get real help to Canadians in a meaningful way? And what I believe would be meaningful is a long-term paid sick leave that's there for Canadians now and forever. That's truly what we need to see in a post-pandemic world. And similarly with the help, we think that EI changes shouldn't just be temporary. They need to be permanent, because we know that 40% of Canadians are covered by EI, but the majority of Canadians, 60%, are not. So for me, it's not good enough to just make a temporary change to EI. We need to see a long-term change to create a social safety net that's there for all Canadians always. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed there's problems with our current social safety net that doesn't cover all workers if they ever fall into a difficult scenario. So yeah, that's something I want to fight for, a long-term permanent solution that helps all Canadian workers in a long-term way.
I guess my question, though, is you've settled for less in the past in exchange for your support. Will you drive a harder line this time around?
Our focus is getting wins for Canadians. So it's really the Liberals that are to blame if they don't come through enough, if they deliver less on Canadians' need. It's really on the Liberal government to answer to that. We're going to just continue to fight every step of the way to get more help, as we have throughout the pandemic, getting more help to Canadians to make sure that they're not left behind, that they're not excluded, they're not forgotten about. That's been our job in the pandemic, and that's what we're going to continue to do. So we'll fight hard for the best deal possible for Canadians. And if the Liberals want to give Canadians less, they'll have to answer that question in an election.
But shouldn't they also have to answer to you? I mean, shouldn't your support be predicated on actually getting the specifics of what you asked for? Or is it more just about being able to go to the electorate later and say, hey, we got some of what you guys wanted?
Well, we're going to show Canadians again and again that we're fighting for them, and we're fighting for the best deal possible. And if the Liberals, don't go through with that and give less than what's ideal, it's really the Liberals that are to blame for that. We're fighting for the best case scenario for Canadians. Also, given the fact that if there's an election, that's a very serious decision to make, given that there will be no help for Canadians for those 6 weeks that we're in an election. So that's a very serious decision I don't take lightly. I'm prepared to do what's necessary, but my main focus is fighting to get the best deal possible. And if the Liberals don't come through on that, that's really Prime Minister Trudeau's responsibility. That's his fault. We're just going to fight for the best deal possible, We're going to fight for people in the way that gives them the help that they need.
Okay, Mr. Singh, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time as always this evening.
Thank you so much.
Leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, here in Ottawa.
I'm going to evaluate as a team. We're going to look at the throne speech. But really, our test is going to be two things. One is we need to have supports in place that do not reduce the amount of financial support that they used to receive. That's one test. And the second one is, yes, we're going to look at the budget as a way to see if they're following through on their words. If they say one thing and then the budget doesn't back it up, then we know that they have not meant what they said.
Welcome back to Power and Politics with the Power panel. Supriya Dwivedi, Shakir Chambers, Françoise Boivin, and Paul Wells. We had a longer conversation after that press conference, Supriya, with Mr. Singh around what the NDP specifically, or maybe not so specifically, is looking at for the throne speech and maybe beyond if there is a budget. How much leverage from your perspective does the NDP have in all of this?
I mean, I think quite a bit. If you're looking realistically here, the Liberals have to be aware of what the seat count is and how they basically, do in fact need quite a bit of support going forward. And I think with respect to just generally the kinds of policies that you would expect the NDP to be pushing for, they're going to be pushing the Liberal government to make sure that they're not disappointing their left flank. They're kind of almost working as their, the angel on the shoulder, making sure that they're going to follow through on a lot of the progressive promises that not only do a lot of, quite frankly, voters are expecting right now, but I think more generally what the country needs. I think Singh can definitely push the public to, let's say something like pharmacare comes to fruition, to push the public in the direction to remind them that it really was the NDP who has been pushing for that historically and for quite some time.
I just wonder, Paul, if they're going to get that sort of agenda that they might be asking for. For example, I mean, like, is the federal government, are the Liberals going to say, yeah, we're committing to $40 billion pharmacare and it's going to happen in the next few years? Or are they going to signal, yes, we're going to expand pharmacare? Are they going to, they're already tempering kind of the stuff that they talked about a few weeks ago, the big green agenda, and saying, well, our first priority is really COVID right now. And we're hearing through various reports that it's not going to be kind of the, gangbuster type of agenda that they might have been signaling that would come a few weeks ago. What do you think? Do you think that the NDP will get what they're asking for?
Yeah, I think all of what you just said, Vashi. The action is shifting from the sort of green recovery to essentially income support for a bunch of reasons. First of all, the green recovery is not as easy as it looked. It's not as popular as it looked, and it's not where Canadians are at. Canadians are those with school-aged children are terrified of sending their kids off to school, and perhaps more terrified of keeping them at home while they're trying to work. you know, and the sort of basics of a stalled economy are still what's preoccupying people. So that's moving the government closer to where Jagmeet Singh would like them to be. And it sounds like the Prime Minister has belatedly decided to actually contact the opposition leaders and ask what they would like. There's no cost in listening, and it may present opportunities to a minority government. It may demonstrate places where they can give one opposition party advantage vis-a-vis another opposition party and play regional divide and conquer games, and keep this government in power for a little longer, which is becoming increasingly clear that's what the Liberals would prefer. The talk of an early election, which always seemed a little unpersuasive, has essentially gone away. I think everyone's trying to figure out a way that they can actually let this Parliament run for a little while and seek advantage from what happens in it.
Strategically, Françoise, is it a good move for the Prime Minister to talk to his counterpart, talk to the leaders of other opposition parties?
Well, it proves to me one more time that it's a government that listened to public opinion and basically based its policy a lot on public opinion. Because remember, Paul touched it, they were talking about a green agenda. Then you kind of heard in the public, is it really the time to address those issues? Now it's all about COVID-19 and so on and so forth. So they seem to go where the wind seems to push them. So on that front, the fact that they were not talking to opposition leaders was doing front page in a lot of the different medias yesterday and the day before, because it made no sense to a lot of people that a minority government, the Prime Minister would not be talking to his colleagues from the other side. So they decided suddenly, oh, surprise, to start having some discussion, because yesterday the Prime Minister, to that question, was saying, oh, well, I know what they want because they've made their demands pretty public and so on and so forth. So you see that they're pretty much, I don't know if it's listening power or just afraid of doing the wrong things, but anyway. And I saw from Jagmeet Singh interview with you that they already lowered the expectations on their vote on the throne speech, because for him, basically what you have to remember is that he's saying quite clearly the throne speech will not be the important factor for the NDP, because it's only words, and mostly only words with the Liberals. We will wait for a budget. And hearing that Minister Freeland is talking a lot with Paul Martin, because we heard that from her press conference. I don't know if it bodes well. I know he's one of the best finance minister we had, but for those who wants to see a lot of spending, he might not be recognized for the minister who spend a lot.
Yeah, I take your point. I think when it comes to being responsive to public opinion, there's two ways to look at it, Shakir. There's just sort of kowtowing to public opinion, some would say, but there's also being responsive to what people are feeling and thinking at this moment in time, especially when there is a pandemic. And I think, you know, there are a wide variety of concerns that Canadians have, but like Paul said, we're in the middle of, 4-hour waits at testing centers. People are worried about that right now. And it's probably, if the government wasn't responsive to that in their throne speech, they'd be criticized for that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if the government's focusing on the health of Canadians and even economic supports to get Canadians through COVID, I think that's a good decision and a good direction to go in. When you look at some of the reports that were coming out last week about the Liberal priorities as far as healthcare, long-term care, childcare, and then you see some reports today from some NDP MPs saying they have similar priorities such as long-term care and childcare. I think you're already seeing that on the left, they're going to align their views. The devil is always in the details about what comes next. But I think as far as the throne speech is concerned, I think you can look forward to the NDP kind of supporting the Liberals. And again, if it's responsive to the concerns of Canadians, you're in a very good position. The one thing I would say, though, is if you're the opposition, like Mr. O'Toole, if you do see a situation where the Liberals are increasing a lot of spending on these priority issues, and you being the official opposition and you oppose this spending, then you kind of walk into that Liberal narrative that all the Conservatives want to do is cut. They don't want to invest in Canadians, and that can be a very dangerous path to go down.
Yeah, I'm guessing the strategy that he and that party have to employ will be a sort of delicate balancing act depending on what they say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even depending on what they say, but also Mr. O'Toole became the leader of the party saying, I'm not just going to oppose Justin Trudeau. I'm going to have plans for how we govern. So if you say no to these priorities, what is your vision? What does it look like for a conservative government to spend on healthcare or to prioritize economic supports for Canadians? What does that actually look like? And I think they'll need to have put some meat on the bones of those policies.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.